Welcome. I'm Dave Carnes. I'm a member of the Huntington County Historical Society Board. With me today, I have the pleasure of having Jean Gernand. As time goes on, we'll learn a lot more about Jean's history and the history in our local neighborhood of Huntington County. So, welcome, Jean.
Thank you.
I want to go way back. And when did you first become interested in history in general?
Well, my parents were interested, especially my dad. And the one, I can remember them sitting around and talking about, among other things, Johnny Appleseed, John Chapman, and what he had done for this area and beyond. And then when we were going to the 1948 Huntington Centennial pageant, we were driving past the Indian House. We lived north of Andrews on a farm. And my father pointed out that house was built by an Indian. And that just always stuck in my mind that was something special and unusual. And so I just always cared about it, and the interest in history just kind of rubbed off from my father.
Now, your particular family, how far back in Huntington County history does it go?
I have one great-grandfather who was one of the early settlers in the German settlement north of Andrews, and he supposedly came into the area around 1837. And in his obituary, it said that there wasn't a story about Indians and pioneers that he couldn't tell. And unfortunately, I can't find anybody who knows even one of those stories.
It's too bad.
Yeah.
So, as you went through education and high school and then on to Purdue, then different turns in your life came about.
Yes.
When did you able to resurrect your interest in history?
Well, mainly when we moved from Fort Wayne, we bought a very old house and farm north of Huntington, the Nook Farm. And so the house was built before the Civil War, and I discovered a treasure trove of history from that home and from the family, and became so close to the Nook family descendants that we almost feel like we're related, and enjoyed that relationship for 53 years now.
Okay. So you had a very personal connection that got you even more interested.
Right.
And then I know you taught in Fort Wayne for a while.
Yes.
And then when you moved to Huntington, to the system here, and started, what year was that?
We moved to the farm in 1967, and then I started teaching at Huntington North. Not history. Everybody thinks I must have been a history teacher, but I actually taught home economics, family living, and child development.
Okay. Now then a critical juncture came up when you were around a bunch of high school pupils. What inspired you, or how did it come about to restart the Junior Historical Society?
Okay. Well, to back up a little bit, I was still very concerned about the Indian House. And once we were coming home from church, and we noticed all the doors were standing open. And so we stopped and closed the doors, and in the process I went through the house. I'd never been inside before. And I saw all that original detail and those wonderful fireplaces, and that really made me even more concerned about it.
Okay.
And so I tried several different ways to get a restoration of the house started. There was some sort of an ad hoc group of people wanting to make improvements in Huntington County, and I went out and took slides, and I wanted to do a slide presentation to try to get them to wake up to all the wonderful history that we have in this area. That didn't work out. And then I tried to get the Boy Scouts involved, and that didn't go anywhere. And then in the Fort Wayne Journal-Gazette, I read a report of speech that Luke Shear, who owned the Indian House, had given to the Fort Wayne either Kiwanis or Rotary. And in the speech, his main focus was how important it is to involve youth in local history. And I thought, aha, that's my opening. And so we invited him to come out one evening. We spent a very pleasant evening visiting. And then I kind of broached the subject of what I wanted to do. The Junior Historical Society at the high school at that time was not very active at all. And so a couple of other teachers also helped, and home ec teachers also. And so we involved Luke in getting the club organized, and we had some very interesting field trips that he planned for us, and so, he was involved. And still, when we breached the subject of actually working on the house, he'd always kind of put it off. And then along came Stan Bibbas, who he helped us with the club some, and then he befriended Luke. And he was the one that finally made the breakthrough so that we could start working very hard on restoring the house.
Okay.
And aside to that, I was just reading that book that came back on the history of the Historical Society, the Adult Historical Society, and I was so interested to see that in their write-ups, the year we reorganized, we had about 12 or 15 students attending each of their meetings, the adult group, and they were so happy to have the kids there. And I had kind of forgotten that, but I think that's a wonderful thing.
Yes.
That the students would give their time and come. And so we had a nice cooperative working relationship.
Okay.
So that was kind of how
and so as a group, you got together and helped move things along.
Yes.
And were you able to get other people involved at that point too?
A few.
Okay.
Yes. They were mainly other teachers. We had wonderful Bob Diffenbaugh, who was our rock. And he rehung and stabilized every one of the outside doors of the Indian House.
Okay.
And then Jim Taylor was our German teacher, and Jack Oberholzer was industrial arts, and they repaired holes in the floor, and Jim replicated spindles for the beautiful old stairway that had been totally demolished. So it was kind of a Huntington North.
So there was a lot of physicality at that time, getting things
and
done.
Our mission was, in part, was to try to convince Luke that people really were interested in local history. And we planned a neat Sunday afternoon gathering right along the river, and Luke gave a talk on some different aspects of local history, and that's how I got Bob Diffenbaugh involved, because he happened to come to that program.
Okay.
And so we had a lot of fun. We ate a lot of Doritos and drank a lot of Mountain Dew.
Mountain Dew. Kept yourselves well fueled. Okay. Now, as that went forward, but there were other things the Junior Historical Society was getting involved in at that time, and can you fill us in?
Well, when we had done it, actually we worked so hard on that house, we actually had it ready for an open house in Heritage Days. We started in March of 1977, and by June the lower level was ready for tours, and we had a good turnout. And a man that I didn't know stopped by and offered to bring some of his antique furniture in, and Ray Pegan brought some things, and then a commercial artist from Fort Wayne. We were written up in the Fort Wayne newspapers, and he stopped by and he wanted to make signs for us, and so he made some beautiful interpretive signs. One said Forks of the Wabash in French, and another was a description of the beautiful wilderness and all the beautiful flowers and berries and everything. So that was nice. And then we had candlelight tours.
Now, in that time period, I wasn't around. When was the actual structure moved?
Oh, that was much later.
Okay.
And in fact, I think maybe you're planning to do a whole program on the Indian House.
We hope to, yes.
Yeah, so maybe we
Can go into that at that time,
yeah.
so tune in future episodes.
But then anyhow, after we had done this work, we made a slide program on the restoration of the Indian House. And at that time, there were a lot of service clubs and groups that were always looking for programs. And so, again, our kids were trained, they gave the program. And so we went all around the town and beyond giving that program.
Well, to have, multiple kids at that time interested in history had to be amazing.
Well, we were very pleased. We had a good group. And some of them, when they found out how hard and dirty the work was, we didn't see them. But then we actually won Young Preservationist Award from the National Trust for Historic Preservation. And that involved a trip to Washington, D.C., and we were given the award at the Stephen Decatur House, and it was presented by Cecil Andrus, the Secretary of the Interior.
Yes.
So that was quite a thrill.
Well, that was very nice for them
Yes,
to
it was.
get that, and well earned.
But going back, I've always loved old buildings.
Okay. So that was kind of the first, the history
Yes,
and architecture too.
That was
You
the
thought,
beginning.
okay,
Yeah,
okay.
But in my mind, there are so many advantages of old buildings. I think they're usually so well constructed, and the design is usually excellent, and they were built at a time when there was pride in workmanship. And I know some buildings where, in fact, there's supposedly a school in Ohio where they were going to tear it down, and they worked so hard, and they couldn't make any progress in tearing it down, so they finally gave up and decided to restore it.
Okay, good.
And the charm and the history about the old buildings, I think you just can't match.
No.
And so the other thing that really appeals to me is adaptive reuse. If you have a perfectly well-constructed building, there are often a lot of other uses that can be made of the building. And then we're supposed to be concerned about the environment and energy. And when you think it took energy to build the structure, it will take more energy to tear it down, and even more energy if it's replaced. So environmentally, it makes good sense for adaptive reuse. So those are some of the things. And if we have time, I have my favorite quote.
We do.
From John Ruskin, and he says, "It is an imperative social duty of the present to protect the monuments of the past. There is no question of expediency or feeling as to whether we shall preserve the buildings of past times or not. We have no right whatever to touch them. They are not ours. They belong partly to those who built them and partly to all the generations of mankind who are to follow us." Isn't that good?
That is a great quote. So there's kind of a deeper mission also. In history, there's always a curiosity.
Right.
But then I think you saw the virtue of history and buildings.
In so many ways, right.
Okay.
And my husband also was interested in history. He was mainly a math teacher, but he did teach some history classes.
Okay.
And we were very lucky because we shared so many common interests.
Okay.
And when we traveled, it was usually to historic places.
Okay.
And we could see the value and see the possibilities. And places like Marshall, Michigan, and Madison, Indiana, and Metamora, which is the canal town, and Piqua, Ohio is another canal town. And so I could see the possibilities here.
Sure.
But it was a challenge to try to interest other people.
Okay. Now, you got into a dynamic program, if you will, with the Pioneer Festival. Can you tell us how that started?
Sure. I had happened to go to the Johnny Appleseed Festival the first year that it was started a year before ours. And
it was kind of small, obviously, but I thought that looked really interesting. And then I started thinking, why couldn't we have a festival here? And I'm embarrassed to say I was sitting in church one Sunday morning and my mind started to wander. And I started making notes on the program of the different things that we could do and who we might involve. And that was in 1976.
Somewhat of a religious inspiration, perhaps.
Yes. And so again, I went to my fellow teachers and they thought it sounded interesting. And so we got together and worked out a plan and had the first Pioneer Festival on October 16th, 1976 at the high school. The first 3 years were at the high school. And we had a really nice assortment of vendors, and we had continuous slideshows of different historic topics in the building. We had some wonderful music, and I had written a historic bus tour, and so several different people. Ray Pegan was one of our bus tour guides, and Leon Stong, an English teacher. And we ran that, and we had old cars, we had pony rides. The Fort Wayne Parks Department actually came down and did Pioneer Games for children. And so it was a pretty nice beginning. Didn't have too many people there. It was probably the coldest October 16th on history. It even snowed a little bit.
Oh, wow. So it had to be
had some challenges.
Thinking about next year. Well, it can't be any worse, perhaps.
Yeah, right. So Junior Historical Society continued as the main sponsor for the first 6 years. After 3 years, we moved it to Hyers Park.
Okay.
And we had it for only one day, which was an enormous task to set it up and tear it down in the same day.
Yes.
But we had a lot of wonderful vendors and people involved. So
a lot of organizational skills were used too.
Well, it was kind of loosely organized, but it worked.
Okay.
Yeah,
Okay.
I know. Mr. Souter from the Warren home brought a van load of their residents, and they did quilting and let's see what else, pottery maybe, and rug weaving, rug braiding, and that was so nice to have them, and so nice of him to make that effort to come. And then when we had it at the high school, the art department was quite active. They also did pottery, and they had a little girl in a Pioneer bonnet and dress, and the art students were painting her portrait, and they also had did the weaving, and so it was Joy Helm was the teacher that worked with us so nicely. So we had a lot of cooperation, and it was fun.
Well, as things grew at that time, you had more and more people involved and interested, and more people to help coordinate things.
And part of my thinking was at that time the morale in Huntington County was not very good, because so many people were not happy about the school consolidation, and also the reservoirs had uprooted so many people from their homes. And so one of my motivations was to try to have something fun and enjoyable for all ages that people could enjoy.
Okay. So. Yes, it makes sense. There was a big disconnection, if you will, at that time.
Yes,
that needed to be reconnected.
Yeah.
And trying to involve the entire county and.
Right. So it was a lot of fun, especially in those early years. And then a lot of people came, but the donations, we tried to depend on donations. And I figured that with the numbers we got, we probably averaged 25 cents a person in donations. And then along came Carol Harmon from the Sciotes, and she got the idea of fencing the park. And then that really helped with our donations.
Okay. Okay.
So that made a big difference.
People still came out and
Yes,
wanted
yeah,
to
right.
see and participate in this.
Yes, yeah.
Okay.
And so with that, we've been able to give well over $50,000 to the Historical Museum and a lot to the Forks.
Yes.
And so it has really benefited the community.
That's awesome, and the Historical Museum very much appreciates
Well,
that.
I'm sure they do.
They do.
It's
They
money
do
well
indeed.
spent.
Well, Jean, I know you've been involved much in historic preservation. Can you give us some
Sure.
insight into that?
Yes, yes. As I said, when we traveled, we could see what other communities were doing. And I could see all the possibilities in Huntington County that have, up until then, seemingly been ignored. And I just felt there's just so much here that Huntington County is so blessed with all the special history, starting with, well, if you were Luke Shear, you'd have to start with the Ice Age, because that was always his beginning. And then the Indians, and of course the French had an influence here. And the canal is such a special history in itself. Delphi has capitalized so much on their canal history. And then the railroads. So it was just so lush with history here that wasn't really noticed very much. And so I just started seeing the possibilities. And I happened to attend a conference, a preservation conference in South Bend. And they opened my eyes to so many different ways of preserving history and restoration of buildings, and they really had their act together. And so, again, I called on some fellow teachers, and we met with Mayor Robbins to talk about forming a preservation organization in Huntington, and he was very supportive. And so we then opened our group to the Chamber of Commerce, some downtown merchants. Bob Smith from the Smith Furniture was a very valuable early member, and he was actually president when we organized. And so we got our 501c3 papers approved, and by the spring of that year, we planned a public meeting, which was held at the St. Peter's family room, and we put out the word. We had about 125 people came that night, and the officials from South Bend came down and showed a wonderful film on historic preservation that showed the different projects that were possible. And so we invited members, and we met. Oh, it seemed like we were meeting almost every week, because there were so many possibilities and things that we could do. Our main focus was the hotel, because it was in shambles. It had been empty for a number of years, and the main sentiment was to tear it down. And again, Bob Smith tried so hard to find ways to save it. I went with him and his wife and the head of the employment agency here in town at that time, the state, to Goshen to talk about how they had done a similar project. And some of them even went to Chicago, because one of the owners lived in Chicago, and it was in such a tangled ownership question that nobody had clear title. Mm-hmm. So it was an enormous task. But anyhow, in the process, we just blitzed the town with our different projects. We had a historic house walk, and Bob Sievers from WoWo, who we belonged to the same little church, and Bob was his daughter's Sunday school teacher, my Bob, and he promoted it a lot on WoWo, mm-hmm. And we had people coming actually from other towns to tour our historic houses, and it was quite successful. That summer we also helped with a series of newspaper articles once a week, focusing on a historic home and its connection to the downtown. Because historic preservation is usually very interested in downtown revitalization. And so we had some human interest stories that went along. And we had local artists draw or paint pictures of historic homes, and we put them into a calendar and sold them. We also did note cards of the Hart Funeral Home, Hart McElhaney Funeral Home, and the courthouse and several other scenes, and we sold the note cards. For Heritage Days, I did another bus tour on the history of Huntington, which was very well received. We also had a gigantic historic display in the old Penny's store windows before it was remodeled. And then we had a slide program that we had done on the history of Huntington and its buildings. And again, I think we showed it more than 80 times to different groups all over. And the point we made at the end, I showed slides of some graves out at, is it Mount Hope, out on Park Drive, I think. And I remember I said, at one time, people who lived in Huntington really cared about the town, and they put forth a great effort to make it a wonderful town. And they're gone now, and it's up to us to do what we can to keep it going and improve it. And I remember Don Purviance came up afterwards, and he said, "That was my father's grave." And Don and Emmy were wonderful supporters.
Yes.
Oh, they were just the greatest. We couldn't have saved the hotel without Emmy, especially.
Yeah.
So, just a little side there. But anyhow, and then also in the process, I learned that northeastern Indiana was going to do a newspaper promoting the different historic sites in this part of the state. And so I thought we should be included, because by that time the Indian House was pretty well along in restoration. We had the sunken gardens and the reservoirs, and which are not really historic, but they were special. And so I contacted civic leaders from, the reservoir participant. Anyhow, I raised $750. And this was our very first attempt at promoting tourism in Huntington.
So what year would that have been?
Well, if you're going to ask me, I hope I can find it in here. And it would have been probably in the early 80s.
Okay.
So, and of course that had wide circulation. I don't see a date anyway. Oh, no? Isn't that something? There's no date. But it had to have been in the early 80s.
Okay.
So, anyhow, that was the beginning.
All right.
And then I noticed that Tippecanoe County had done a brochure. I think they were listing 200 historic sites in Tippecanoe County. And so I thought, well, why not do that for Huntington County?
Yes.
So that took some time, but we have all the little numbers,
Yes.
and they correspond.
Coordinated. Oh,
There's an explanation there.
That's exquisite.
And
Yes.
so we got those ready to sell at a Pioneer Festival. And then we used the pictures from the 1879 Atlas.
Okay.
And then a little history of how each township was organized, and maps of the smaller towns. And so that was another way
yes.
to, that was done in 1984, which was
Okay.
our sesquicentennial year. So, and then pretty early on, we were chosen by Indiana Landmarks Foundation of Indiana to do a survey, a historic sites and structures inventory of the whole county. And it was done with no cost to Huntington County at all. It was funded mainly by leases from offshore drilling and historic landmarks paid for the other part.
Okay.
And we had two young men who spent their summer in Huntington they were trying to identify all the historically significant buildings in the county, which was a humongous task. And so we finally got it all put together, and they rated the buildings. Outstanding meant that it was eligible for National Register listing, and contributing meant that it was important, and N was non-contributing. So I think this is out of print now, but that was another way of recognizing the history. And then, this was my favorite project of all. I contacted, every county has a historian, and I never was, but I contacted the historians from 6 other counties along the Wabash River, and there was an old trail that the French fur trappers used a lot, and it actually was called the Ouiatenon Trail because it ran from Fort Wayne to Fort Ouiatenon at Lafayette. Okay. And this turned out to be a delightful group of people to work with, and my home ec teaching friend, who was my partner in crime in all of this, Mary Margaret Kelsey, would fix a supper, and we would take it down usually to Wabash, because it was kind of a central spot, because they came from Lafayette and up to Fort Wayne. And so each representative from their county came up with the most historic sites in that county.
Okay.
And so you could follow all the way along the Ouiatenon Trail from Fort Wayne to Lafayette. And that was just a lot of fun. And
yes.
Jim Schrader from Spectrum, he was so good to work with us. And Nellie Brock, Nellie Brock, she worked at the Indiana Room at that time, and she was a lovely artist. And she did all of this artwork for us for a very reasonable price. And so that was just another way of promoting tourism in this area.
Highly enjoyable for you.
Yes, yes. Oh. And we did encounter people who were actually following the trail.
Okay.
So that was pretty neat. So I don't know where we are in my notes now, but those are some of the main things.
You mentioned about the Hotel La Fontaine, and that you started in about preserving it, and eventually, how did that finally come about?
Well, that's another story in itself. In fact, we have that documentary that traces a lot of the effort. And the main thing I can say is that I can't imagine a project that had more obstacles than that, because everywhere we turned, there were roadblocks. And the worst one was to get a clear title. And Will Hahn was fabulous in helping to get that accomplished. But then the first year we applied for a HUD grant. We were told the only way to save a hotel was with HUD. And we applied for the HUD grant and were rejected. And instead of giving up, Emmy and George Gopniski, the architect, and Will went down to Indianapolis and met with the HUD people to find out what they needed to do to improve their application. And so the next year they applied again, and it was accepted. And I think that all the HUD money that came to Indiana that year came to the Hotel La Fontaine.
Okay.
But if we wouldn't have had Emmy and Doc Hafner and Jerry Ullman and the key leaders in the community who everybody looked up to, we never could have saved it.
Okay.
So that was a major accomplishment.
that was great work and very fortunate
Yes,
to have had that
Yeah,
done.
right, but at that time, 9 out of 10 people would have said tear it down. You know, it just, people sometimes just have limited vision in the possibilities, but that worked out very well.
Okay.
So
Okay.
that was one of the perks. And,
Yes.
It's a great lesson in perseverance and not giving up.
Mm-hmm.
So,
Don't be ruled by your defeats.
right,
Okay.
definitely. I forgot to say that another thing we did that drew a lot of interest, Historic Landmarks at that time was doing what they called town tours. Again, it was done at no cost to us locally, but they brought in architectural students to survey the downtown buildings. And then they put together what they called were charrettes to show how they could look if they were restored. Beautiful, all in color, nice, great big drawings. And then when they were finished, we had a lunch. And at that time, the only place you could have a group for lunch was upstairs in the Y.
In the gym.
Well, yes, we were up in that meeting room, and it was packed. We did a good job getting the word out, and we had a lot of key community leaders there. Carol Shuttleworth came, and that got her interest.
Okay.
And I have to say that they were very significant in helping with the log house, which is another whole
Yes.
story.
Yes.
But anyhow, the students presented these beautiful drawings, and as a result, that was when Doctors Harmon decided to restore their building, because the students were so thrilled that they discovered an 1844 building hiding behind all that aluminum
Yes.
facade. And so I don't think the Harmons ever got enough credit for doing that project, but that was a wonderful thing.
Good.
And so that town tour was really a special thing
Special.
too. So we just came to people from every side to try to get them excited about their local history. And at that time, I would get so many phone calls from people wanting to tell me about their old building and the history. And then throughout the county, I remember one time a man named Dale Bonowitz called to tell me about an area out in Rock Creek Township where the Indians had buried their treasure. He was an old-time settler, and he said the ones that moved west planned to come back, because they didn't trust taking it with them. But when they did come back, the terrain had been changed so much that they never could find it. So, if you look for buried treasure,
Great
go
story,
out to
yes.
Rock Creek Township.
Yes.
So
Wow.
those were very fun years.
Good.
And we just had so much positive feedback from people who were so interested and excited, and just a lot of good memories. Well, and then in all of this process, I became acquainted with the Purviance House on the
Yes.
south side of town, and we did a story on it in our series of newspaper articles. Excuse me. And I just fell in love with that house when I got inside because it had so much original detail. Well, the Nazarenes were building out west of town, and the house faced a very uncertain future. And then Doc Hafner told me that there were 3 men locally who wanted to buy it and tear it down and put in another strip parking mall. I'm not a shopping mall. And so I got very concerned about that. And so I thought, well, we'll try to find a buyer. And so we had a Christmas open house. And these are friends of mine. They were bringing in some antique furniture. And I had Kate, the wonderful cook from the Huntington North cafeteria. She was there baking cookies. And we had hot cider. And we had it pretty well publicized. And we had a huge crowd come through on a Sunday afternoon. We thought we found a buyer, but that didn't work. And so it was still up for grabs. And I'd always kind of thought about having a bed and breakfast somewhere, and my dear husband was in favor of buying it, and so we bought it at auction and spent a year and a half working on repairs and restoration, and then we had a bed and breakfast there for about 10 years and met so many nice people, but the main reason we bought it was to keep it from being torn down.
Sure, but you lived the history of that.
Yes,
Really.
yes.
That's
And then
that's
again,
great.
we've actually had a Samuel Purviance come from Virginia, and he had lived here as a little boy, and they were so thrilled to come back and see that house, and so that was another project and another really nice experience. The descendants of the family again were just so nice,
To
and so
But they're appreciative of keeping that house alive.
the original granddaughters had a reunion there, and one came from Colorado and one from California, and two from Michigan. And the mother of one actually had been the young girl living in the Purviance house when it was still owned by the family. So
That is a great
That
story.
was very special too.
Thank you.
Oh, and one other thing.
Yes.
Huntington Alert Ben won the Servas Award, which is given out by Indiana Landmarks once a year, and it was to the preservation group in the state of Indiana who had the most impact, and that was in 1982, and we had a lot of good competition for that, so that was a really special award.
That's to be proud of.
We've had some really nice
Oh,
experiences,
yes.
and it was time well. You know, I could have been playing bridge all of that time, or sitting around watching soap operas, and
I'm glad you found this avenue of history that motivates you, and you brought so much good to Huntington
Well,
County.
it's been a pleasure, but I never could have done it without other people's their support and their help, and I don't want any of this to sound like I'm boasting,
No,
because I
no.
don't mean it that way at all. In fact, we resisted for years having our picture in the paper, because we didn't want it to seem like we were doing it to
Yes.
call attention to ourselves. And finally, we did it. My friend Mary Margaret Kelsey, who taught with me and was a co-sponsor of Junior Historical Society, and we finally relented because we had nominated the Madame Lafayette House to the National Register, and so we stood out there in front of this poor, decrepit, sad-looking house in weeds up to our knees, but just to try to promote interest
Sure.
in that house. We've had some heartbreaks and some terrible failures along the way.
But again, you persevered.
Losing the Erie Depot to fire
Yes.
was awful. I'll never get over losing the high school.
Well, again, thank you for watching this interview with Jean Gernand. In the future, we will have some more interviews with Jean, so tune in.